100 miles. That is not a commute. That is not a drive to the airport. That is the distance between you and the next town in 10 specific places in America. And the people who live in those places do not consider this a problem. They consider it home. Isolation in America means different things in different landscapes. In the Nevada desert, it means driving 2 hours on an empty 2-lane highway to reach a grocery store, watching the speedometer and the fuel gauge with equal attention because both matter equally out here. In the Alaskan interior, it means no road at all, just a plain, a river, a dog sled trail in winter, and the understanding that self-sufficiency is not a philosophy, but a survival requirement. In the Wyoming high plains, it means a horizon so flat and so distant that the curvature of the earth becomes visible, and the nearest neighbor is measured not in houses, but in miles of empty grass between one set of lights and the next. The 10 towns on this list are the most isolated, permanently inhabited places in the continental United States and Alaska. Some of them have hundreds of residents who chose to be there. Some have dozens who had no choice but stayed anyway. And at least one of them is so remote that the federal government classified its mail route as a navigational challenge rather than a postal service. Subscribe. We are going to the edge of where America lives. Let's break it down. Number 10. Beatty, Nevada. Beatty sits in Nye County, Nevada, the third largest county by area in the continental United States, with a population of about 50,000 scattered across 18,000 square miles of desert. The town itself has about 900 residents, a gas station, a casino, a handful of motels, and a position on U.S. Route 95 that makes it the last supply point before Death Valley National Park for travelers heading south and the first sign of civilization for those heading north. Las Vegas is 105 miles away. Tonopah, the next significant Nevada town, is 100 miles north. What Beatty actually is: a genuine desert town that has been serving travelers, miners, and people who actively choose Nevada emptiness since the early 1900s. The Rhyolite Ghost Town, one of the most photographed and most preserved in the American West, is 4 miles away. Its bank ruins and bottle house drawing tourists who then stop in Beatty for gas and food. The Amargosa Valley to the south has a small farming community sustained by artesian wells. The landscape in every direction is the Mojave and Great Basin Desert, which is beautiful in a way that requires time and silence to understand and rewards neither a quick visit nor an Instagram filter. The isolation arithmetic. A Beatty resident with a medical emergency that exceeds the town's basic clinic capabilities drives 105 miles to Las Vegas. A Beatty student who qualifies for a college program drives or flies from the nearest commercial airport in Las Vegas. A Beatty resident who needs a specific part for a specific machine either orders it and waits or drives a combined 210-mile round trip. These logistics are not hardships the residents are enduring while waiting to escape. They are the mathematics of living in Nevada desert, and they are accepted as the baseline condition of the choice. People in Beatty know things that Las Vegas people have forgotten. They know how to fix things because the parts are 2 hours away. They know their neighbors because their neighbors are the only ones there. They know what the sky looks like at night because there is nothing between them and it. I have visited 6 times. Every time I leave, I feel like I am going back to somewhere smaller, which is disorienting because Las Vegas is not small. Nevada Travel Writer, 2024, number 9. Glenrio. New Mexico Glenrio is technically 2 towns in one abandoned shell, straddling the New Mexico-Texas state line on the old Route 66 alignment. It once served travelers on the Mother Road as a fuel, food, and overnight stop in the era before Interstate 40 bypassed it into irrelevance. Today, Glenrio has a population that fluctuates between 0 and a handful of people depending on who is maintaining the remaining structures. Sitting in one of the most geographically isolated positions of any named community in the lower 48 states. The isolation geometry. The nearest town with any services in either direction on I-40 is Tucumcari, New Mexico, 40 miles west, and Adrian, Texas, 40 miles east. But Glenrio sits south of the interstate on a county road that most GPS systems either misroute or ignore entirely. The visual isolation is more complete than the mileage suggests. The Texas Panhandle and eastern New Mexico plains produce a flatness so absolute that the distance to the horizon is not a landscape feature, but a physical limit of human perception. Why it matters. Glenrio represents the category of town that isolation killed directly. Route 66 towns depended on traffic. When Interstate 40 moved the traffic, the towns that the interstate bypassed did not decline, they stopped. Glenrio stopped in approximately 1975 when the last business closed. What remains are structures in various states of preservation, a state line marker, and the Route 66 alignment that still runs through the town site like a scar from a surgery the patient did not survive. The people who visit Glenrio are Route 66 pilgrims and landscape photographers, and people who are drawn to the particular American melancholy of a place that functioned completely and then simply ceased to function. Leaving everything behind. The isolation that killed Glenrio is the same isolation that preserves what remains of it, too far from anything for anyone to bother with demolition, close enough to the interstate for the occasionally curious to find. Quick rant. Route 66 towns are not ghost towns in the haunted house sense. They are ghost towns in the economic sense. Places that were as alive and purposeful as anywhere in America until the interstate moved the road and took the economy with it. Glenrio was a full town. It had a cafe, a motel, a gas station, businesses on both sides of a state line. Then the interstate opened, and within 10 years, there was nothing. The buildings are still standing. The economy is not. This is what happens when your entire reason for existing is a road, and someone builds a better road somewhere else. Number 8. Oatman, Arizona. Oatman sits in the Black Mountains of Mojave County, Arizona, accessible from the east via Route 66 on a series of switchbacks that made it one of the most challenging stretches of the Mother Road in the era, before air conditioning made desert driving survivable for most vehicles. The town has about 150 year-round residents, a main street designed for gold rush tourism with burros that wander freely and have been declared a town attraction, and a position in a mountain valley that makes the 30-mile drive to Kingman feel significantly longer than the mileage suggests. What makes Oatman isolated despite its proximity? The Black Mountains are not high by Western standards, but they are genuinely rugged, and the road over them has not fundamentally changed since the 1920s. In summer, the drive is a heat and grade challenge that has stranded unprepared vehicles for a century. In winter, on the same road can be rendered impassable by ice that the low-altitude desert of Kingman and Laughlin never experiences. Oatman sits in a thermal and meteorological pocket that makes it function as a genuinely isolated mountain community, despite its location on a marked highway. The Burros. The wild burros of Oatman are descended from animals released by prospectors when the mines played out in the 1930s. They have been wandering the town and the surrounding desert for nearly a century. While they approach vehicles on the main street expecting food, have learned to open car doors on hot days in search of produce, and have been responsible for more surprise tourist reactions than any other single feature of the town. The Burros are the unofficial government of Oatman. The 150 residents are their subjects. Oatman's isolation is the most scenic on this list. The Black Mountains in the late afternoon light produce colors that photographers drive from Los Angeles to document. And the Route 66 alignment through the town is genuinely intact in a way that few sections are. The isolation is not depressing here. It is structural, baked into the geography of the mountains and the single difficult road. And the town has found a way to make the difficulty of reaching it part of what makes reaching it worth doing. The Burros in Oatman tried to get into my car for 7 minutes. I was not fast enough with the window. I had an apple. Word had spread. By the time I closed the window, there were 4 Burros evaluating my vehicle with the professional assessment of animals who've been doing this since before I was born. Oatman has been here since 1906. The Burros have been here since 1930. The tourists have been here since whenever Route 66 made it accessible. The Burros have clearly won the competition for who owns the town. R/Road Trip 2024, number 7, Denio, Nevada. Denio Junction sits on the Nevada-Oregon state line in Humboldt County. Nevada, one of the most genuinely empty corners of the American West. The nearest town of any substance is Winnemucca, Nevada, approximately 120 miles south. The nearest town with any substance in Oregon is Burns, 110 miles north. Denio itself has a gas station, a motel, a bar, and approximately 50 residents who are there because the ranching economy of the northern Nevada and southeastern Oregon high desert requires people at its supply point. What 120 miles of Nevada means. U.S. Route 95 between Winnemucca and Denio is one of the emptier federal highways in the continental United States. For much of that drive, there is nothing. Not a building, not a power line, not a light at night. Just the Great Basin Desert at its most honest. Sagebrush, alkali flats, occasional mountain ranges, and a sky that begins to feel personal rather than scenic after the first hour of driving under it. The economy of extreme isolation. Denio exists because cattle ranching in the surrounding high desert requires a supply point and a fuel stop. The ranches that depend on Denio are themselves isolated. Individual operations covering tens of thousands of acres of Bureau of Land Management grazing allotments where the nearest neighbor is a day's drive away. Denio is the urban center for a ranching economy that makes Denio's 50 people seem like a metropolis by comparison to what exists on the surrounding range. Denio is the most quintessentially Western entry on this list, the supply stop for the ranching economy of the high desert. Existing precisely and only because the isolation around it is so complete that the 50 people who live there and the services they provide are the difference between ranching being possible and ranching being impossible within a 100-mile radius. It has no pretension to being anything other than what it is, a gas station and a bar, and a motel at a state line in the empty middle of the West. I stopped in Denio on a research trip through the Great Basin. The woman behind the bar had lived there for 34 years. She knew every rancher within 80 miles by name, cattle count, and the year their family homesteaded the land. She knew which roads were passable in wet weather and which were not. She knew what the Humboldt River was doing and what that meant for the ranches to the south. She was the most comprehensively informed person about a specific geography I have ever met. Denio is 50 people. She was its memory. Great Basin Writer, 2023. Number 6, Bunkerville, Nevada. Bunkerville sits in the Virgin River Valley of Clark County, Nevada. 85 miles northeast of Las Vegas in the narrow strip of Arizona-adjacent Nevada that squeezes between Utah and Arizona along the Virgin River Corridor. It became nationally known in 2014 when the Bundy Ranch Standoff, a confrontation between rancher Cliven Bundy, his supporters, and the Bureau of Land Management over decades of unpaid grazing fees, drew armed protesters and national media attention to a town that had previously been notable primarily for its quiet Mormon agricultural community and the river that makes farming possible in this corner of desert. What Bunkerville is beneath the news coverage, a Virgin River agricultural community of about 1,300 people that has been farming cotton, alfalfa, and orchard crops in the narrow river bottom since Mormon pioneers settled it in 1877. The Virgin River Gorge to the northeast provides access to and from Utah and Arizona. The surrounding landscape is Mojave Desert, Red Rock Canyon country that photographers and hikers travel specifically to experience. The town's isolation from Las Vegas is real, despite the relatively modest 85-mile distance, because that distance crosses terrain that has no services, limited water, and summer temperatures that make car trouble a potentially serious emergency. The BLM land context. The Bundy situation brought national attention to something that is simply ordinary in rural Nevada: the complex relationship between ranchers, federal land management, and grazing rights that covers hundreds of millions of acres of western public land. Bunkerville's neighbors, ranching families who have worked BLM allotments for generations, live in a landscape where the lines between private property, federal land, state land, and traditional use rights are genuinely complex and have been contested since the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. The 2014 standoff was unusual in its escalation. The underlying dispute is not unusual at all. Bunkerville before 2014 was a Virgin River farming town that very few people outside Clark County had ever heard of. It had the river, the red rocks, the alfalfa fields, and the quiet of a community that has been in the same place doing the same things since 1877. After 2014, it became a symbol of a larger argument. The town itself did not change. The argument moved through it and kept going. The alfalfa is still growing. The river is still running. The isolation is still 85 miles of desert in every direction. Nevada Rural Affairs Writer 2023, number 5, Escalante, Utah. Escalante sits in Garfield County, Utah, one of the least populated counties in the lower 48 states, covering 5,175 square miles with a population of about 5,000 people. The town itself has approximately 800 residents and serves as the gateway community for the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, 1.7 million acres of canyon country that contains some of the most remote and least visited terrain in the continental United States. The nearest town of comparable size is Panguitch to the northwest, 65 miles on Utah Highway 12, one of the most scenic roads in America. Highway 12. The 124-mile Highway 12 between Panguitch and Torrey is regularly cited as one of the most beautiful roads in the United States and possibly in the world. It crosses slick rock ridges where the pavement runs along a narrow spine with canyon drops on both sides, passes through the Escalante River drainage system with views that travel photographers specifically plan trips to capture, and connects communities that would otherwise have no practical road access to each other. Escalante sits at its midpoint in a valley surrounded by canyon walls and rim rock that have been eroding and redrawing themselves for 65 million years. The isolation of genuine remoteness. The Grand Staircase Escalante Monument that surrounds Escalante is roadless for most of its 1.7 million acres. The canyons that cut through it, Coyote Gulch, the Escalante River Corridor, the Hole in the Rock route, require either multi-day backpacking or four-wheel drive access. Cell service in the monument is essentially zero. The town of Escalante itself has limited cell service and internet that reflects its position in a valley surrounded by canyon walls that block signals effectively. Medical emergencies that exceed the local clinic's capacity require a drive of at minimum 65 miles to a hospital. Escalante is the most geographically spectacular isolation on this list. The canyon country surrounding it is genuinely among the most dramatic landscapes on Earth. The isolation is not a consequence of poverty or economic collapse. It is a consequence of geology, of being in the middle of a landscape that is so magnificently inhospitable to infrastructure that the infrastructure simply does not exist. The 800 residents of Escalante live inside one of the most beautiful geographic positions of any small American town, and accept the logistics of that position as the price of admission. I moved to Escalante from Salt Lake City for the landscape. I knew it was isolated. I did not fully understand isolated until I needed a specific medication that the local clinic did not stock, and the nearest pharmacy was 65 miles away. I also did not fully understand the landscape until I had been living inside it for 3 months, and the canyon walls became not scenery, but orientation. The thing I used to know where I was, rather than a view I stopped to photograph. Escalante does this. The landscape stops being something you look at and starts being something you live inside. Escalante Resident, Utah, Public Radio Feature, 2024, number 4, Presidio, Texas. Presidio sits on the Rio Grande at the U.S.-Mexico border, opposite Ojinaga, Chihuahua, a position that makes it simultaneously more connected than its American isolation statistics suggest, and more isolated than any U.S. border town of comparable size. It has about 4,000 residents. You're in an international port of entry that processes commercial and passenger traffic between the U.S. and Mexico, and a position in the Trans-Pecos region of Texas that puts it more than 200 miles from the nearest major American city in any direction. El Paso is 220 miles west, Midland, Odessa is 230 miles northeast, Del Rio is 250 miles east. The border duality. Presidio's isolation from American urban centers is paired with its direct connection to Ojinaga, a Mexican city of about 30,000 people just across the bridge. The commercial, social, and family connections between Presidio and Ojinaga have been continuous for as long as both communities have existed. The border does not isolate Presidio from Ojinaga. It defines their relationship. Many Presidio residents have family on both sides. The grocery options in Ojinaga are better and cheaper than in Presidio. The river that defines the border is the same river that made both communities possible. Candelaria and Ruidosa. Upstream from Presidio along the Rio Grande corridor are two communities, Candelaria and Ruidosa, that achieve isolation levels that make Presidio seem metropolitan. Candelaria has approximately 50 residents and no paved road access from the south. Reaching it requires either a rough county road from Presidio or crossing through Ojinaga on the Mexican side. Ruidosa has a seasonal population of a few dozen people and no services. The Big Bend stretch of the Rio Grande between Presidio and Big Bend National Park is one of the most isolated inhabited river corridors in America. Presidio's heat is the detail that most outsiders underestimate. In summer, Presidio regularly records the highest temperatures in the continental United States. 115 to 120 degrees Fahrenheit is documented. The heat is not theoretical. It shapes every aspect of daily life from June through September, determining when people work, when they move, what equipment survives, and how seriously any infrastructure failure is treated. The isolation plus the heat produces a resilience in Presidio residents that is visible and specific, the kind that develops in places where the consequences of being unprepared are immediate and unambiguous. Presidio is 220 miles from El Paso. It is also directly across the river from a Mexican city of 30,000 people. Americans think of Presidio as isolated. Presidio residents think of themselves as sitting at the intersection of two countries, two cultures, two economies, and the most dramatic river canyon in North America. Both are correct. The isolation is in one direction, the connection is in another. Presidio faces south as much as it faces north, which is the honest geography of living on a border. Trans-Pecos Journalist, 2024, number 3, Terlingua, Texas. Terlingua has appeared in this series before as a ghost town comeback story, as an off-grid community, and it returns here because it earns its place on the isolation list specifically. Big Bend National Park and Big Bend Ranch State Park together create a protected landscape of over 1.2 million acres surrounding Terlingua on 3 sides. The nearest town with a full grocery store is Alpine, Texas, 80 miles north. The nearest city is Midland, 230 miles northeast. The nearest major city with an international airport and full urban services is San Antonio, 360 miles east. What the numbers mean in practice? A Terlingua resident who needs medical care beyond the volunteer EMS capabilities drives 80 miles to Alpine or 100 miles to Presidio for a clinic or is airlifted to a hospital for anything serious. A Terlingua resident who wants a specific item that cannot be found in the trading post drives to Alpine or orders online and waits for delivery, which to the Big Bend area can take longer than standard shipping estimates suggest. A Terlingua resident who wants company that is not already in Terlingua either drives to it or accepts that company must be manufactured from the 400 year-round residents already present. The deliberate choice at scale. Terlingua's 400 year-round residents chose this, not one person making a solitary stand, not a community that stayed because leaving was impossible, but 400 people who evaluated the 360 miles to San Antonio and the 80 miles to Alpine and the zero-service conditions of the surrounding desert and decided that the Chisos Mountains and the Rio Grande and the silence and the specific community of people who make the same choice were worth it. That collective, deliberate choice produces a social culture unlike anywhere else in America. The confidence of people who know exactly why they are where they are and have no uncertainty about the decision. Terlingua is also the entry on this list with the most sustainable long-term isolation model. The solar power community infrastructure means energy independence. The water collection systems mean water independence. The proximity to Big Bend means a perpetual stream of tourists who support the trading post, the restaurant, the campgrounds. The isolation is not a problem being managed. It is the feature that produces the community that makes the isolation worthwhile. People ask if I get lonely in Terlingua. I have 400 neighbors who made the same decision I did. We all know why we are here. We all know what we traded for being here. When you share that specific knowledge with 400 people, you have more in common with them than with millions of people in cities where nobody examined why they ended up where they are. I am not isolated. I am in a community of people who chose the same thing. That is the opposite of isolated. Terlingua resident, Texas Observer, 2024. Number 2, Coldfoot, Alaska. Coldfoot, Alaska sits 250 miles north of Fairbanks on the Dalton Highway, the haul road built to service the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that is one of the most demanding drives available to the American public. It sits above the Arctic Circle at the edge of the Brooks Range, in a position that makes it the northernmost truck stop in North America and one of the most isolated year-round inhabited places in the United States. Year-round population, approximately 10 people. Seasonal population during summer tourist season significantly higher, serving travelers attempting the Dalton Highway to Deadhorse and Prudhoe Bay. The Dalton Highway. The Dalton is 414 miles of predominantly unpaved road running from Livingood, north of Fairbanks, to Deadhorse on the Arctic Ocean. It was built for pipeline support vehicles and was not open to the public until 1994. Services along the entire 414-mile route are limited to 3 locations: Yukon River Camp, Coldfoot, and Deadhorse. Between these points, a breakdown or accident occurs in conditions where help is measured in hours rather than minutes, and where seasonal temperature extremes, from -70 Fahrenheit in winter to +90 in summer, make improvised repairs the difference between inconvenient and fatal. What Coldfoot provides: fuel, food, a small motel, basic mechanical assistance, emergency communications. The Coldfoot Camp Complex, operated as a tourism and pipeline support facility, is the only shelter and service point for a 240-mile stretch of the Dalton. For the truckers who supply Deadhorse year-round, Coldfoot is a mandatory stop. For the tourists who attempt the Dalton in summer, it is the last point of preparation before the most remote driving in North America. For its 10 year-round residents, it is simply home, in the Brooks Range, above the Arctic Circle, where the aurora borealis appears from August through April, and the summer sun does not set for 24-hour periods in June and July. Coldfoot is the entry on this list where isolation becomes something other than a real estate or lifestyle consideration. At -70 Fahrenheit, isolation is a survival variable. The 10 year-round residents understand this in a way that no amount of reading about it fully conveys. The Brooks Range in winter is the most demanding inhabited environment in the United States, and the people who maintain Coldfoot through those conditions are there because the pipeline economy and the tourism economy require a human presence that no automated system has yet replaced. I worked a winter season at Coldfoot. -70 is not a temperature that maps onto anything in normal human experience. Your exhaled breath freezes before it clears your face. Metal breaks. Rubber stops working. Diesel gels. The darkness is total from November through January. The aurora is constant. The stars are close enough to feel personal. I would do it again immediately. I would also never pretend to someone who has not been there that I can explain what it is. Dalton Highway Worker, Alaska Magazine, 2024, Number 1, Adak, Alaska. Adak is a city, officially, legally, administratively a city, with a mayor, a city council, a school, a harbor, a small commercial district, and approximately 300 year-round residents. It is also located on Adak Island in the Aleutian Chain, 1,200 miles southwest of Anchorage, 300 miles from the nearest inhabited island in any direction, in the middle of the North Pacific Ocean, where the Bering Sea and the Pacific meet and produce weather conditions that have been described by everyone who has experienced them as among the most extreme on Earth. How Adak came to exist. The United States Navy built a massive military installation on Adak during World War II. One of the largest in the Pacific Theater, with runways, harbor facilities, housing for thousands of personnel, and infrastructure that made Adak temporarily one of the most developed military bases in the Pacific. At its peak, 6,000 military personnel were stationed there. The Navy maintained significant operations through the Cold War, using Adak as a surveillance and submarine detection platform in the North Pacific. In 1997, the Navy withdrew, leaving behind an infrastructure designed for 6,000 people and a civilian population that gradually settled in the remaining facilities. Adak today. The 300 year-round residents of Adak are primarily involved in the commercial fishing industry. The Aleutian Islands produce some of the most productive fishing grounds in the world, and Adak's harbor serves as a processing and resupply point for the fleets working the Bering Sea. The Alaska Groundfish Data Bank operates a fish processing facility. The infrastructure left by the Navy, roads, utilities, housing, the harbor, is maintained at a fraction of its original capacity and constitutes the physical skeleton of the city. The buildings that once housed 6,000 people serve 300. The weather. Adak sits in the Aleutian Low, the persistent low-pressure system that generates the storms that cross the North Pacific and eventually become the weather systems that hit the continental United States. In their formation zone, these storms are something different. Sustained winds of 60 to 80 miles per hour are not exceptional events in Adak. They are part of the monthly reality. Visibility can drop to zero in Willowas, sudden violent gusts that arrive without warning. The average temperature rarely rises above 50 Fahrenheit even in summer. The island receives over 60 inches of precipitation annually, most of it horizontal. Adak is the most isolated, permanently inhabited city in the United States by every measure that matters. Distance from the nearest large population center, distance from the nearest hospital with full capabilities, distance from the nearest city with comparable services, flight time from any major airport, and the specific isolation of being surrounded by open ocean that makes road travel not merely impractical, but physically impossible. And yet 300 people live there year-round. They have built a community in the physical shell of a military installation that was designed for 20 times their number on an island that the weather treats as a laboratory for testing the limits of what wind and water can do to infrastructure and morale. The fishing economy sustains them. The Navy's roads and utilities support them. The North Pacific surrounds them with conditions that most Americans will never experience and would not choose. Why do they stay? The same answer that everyone on this list gives, in some version: because it is home. Because the community that exists in extreme conditions is a specific community that cannot be replicated in easier places. Because the Pacific salmon run and the sea otters in the harbor and the aurora on clear nights, and the specific quality of belonging to a place that most Americans have never heard of and could not find on a first attempt at a map, produces something that proximity to a Whole Foods and a reliable cell signal has never managed to provide as a substitute. Adak is 1,200 miles from Anchorage. The weather tries to remove your house from its foundation on a regular basis. The nearest hospital with a surgeon is a 2-hour flight away. I have been here 11 years. I have watched the salmon return to the streams every August. I have watched the sea otters raft in the harbor every evening. I have seen the North Pacific in every mood it has, and it has many moods, most of them violent. I am not leaving. This is the place that knows my name and I know its. That is not something you find. That is something that happens to you if you stay long enough in the right place. Adak Resident, Aleutian Islands documentary, 2024, 10 towns, 10 different versions of being 100 miles from anyone, 10 different answers to the question of what makes people stay in places that most of the country has decided are too far from everything to be worth the difficulty. None of these places are for everyone. The person who needs a hospital within 20 minutes should not move to Adak. The person who requires a full grocery store on Tuesday should not move to Coldfoot. The person who cannot function without reliable cell service should not move to Denio. The isolation on this list is not a lifestyle aesthetic that can be approximated. It is the actual condition of living in specific geographies at specific distances from the infrastructure that the rest of America takes for granted. But the people who do stay, the 10 residents of Coldfoot, the 300 of Adak, the 400 of Terlingua, the 900 of Beatty, the 800 of Escalante, are not there because they lost a negotiation with the world. They are there because they found something in the distance and the difficulty and the specific community that forms when everyone around you made the same impossible seeming choice. That something is real. It does not photograph well. It cannot be described in a real estate listing. It is only available in the place itself. To the people who stayed long enough to receive it, the closest neighbor is 100 miles away. For the people on this list, that is not a problem. That is the address. Comment below which town genuinely surprised you and whether you would last 6 months in any of them. Be honest, I read everyone. Like this video if Adak or Terlingua changed how you think about what isolation actually means. subscribe, because the next video covers the opposite end of the spectrum, the most densely packed small towns in America, where everyone knows your business before you do, and whether that is better or worse than 100 miles of empty road. That answer is more complicated than you expect.